You know what? He can beat Magnus. Maybe I can be like him too.
There you go. We have the games are underway in the second half of the 5+1 portion. And Eric, looks like we have a King's Indian to start things off.
Yeah, I didn't know this was part of his repertoire, but that's good for us, good for the fans. Typically, very sharp opening. Hikaru used to use the King's Indian all the time for moments when you need a decisive result.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and one thing I've noticed already about the position is the rook has slid to the e8 square, and then we saw the position close with the move d5. That's something that usually you want to time when the black rook moves over, you play d5, because the plan for black that most chess players are familiar with is to strike with f5. And so the rook honestly wants to be back on that f8 square. So cleverly waiting for the rook to shift and then closing the center.
Yeah, I guess with rook e8, I'm not sure if Denis is striving for a close position against Magnus. Typically, when you look at the styles, Magnus is known as a very good player in maneuvering and understanding close positions. But at the same time, Denis is very positionally solid. And look at this move, king h8. That's attached to the idea that I know of knight g8 and bishop h6, trading off that dark squared bishop that's blocked by, the pawn on e5.
Exactly. You talk about good and bad bishops. Your good bishop, that bishop on d7 for black, the opposite color of where most of those pawns are fixed. And so you mentioned a nice plan, trading off black's, let's say, poor bishop on g7 for white's good bishop on e3 is a great plan to follow. I'm not used to the queen side actually being closed like this for white with the move a4, Eric. This move struck me as a little bit weird because I often see white go for b3, a3, and b4 to continue to expand. But the move a4 completely shuts things down until the move b4 later, but you can't achieve it at the moment.
Yeah, I don't understand a4 at all, I have to be honest. I'm really used to white playing a3, b4. Look at the knights on c3 and d3. Look at the bishop on e3. They're ready to support this b4, c5 push with the pawn on a3. But with the pawn on a4, like generally in the King's Indian, white's supposed to push on the queen side, and you need pawn flexibility. You need to be able to push your pawns forward. Here, even if white prepares b4 in the future, you'll notice the a4 pawn will then be isolated. The c4 pawn won't have any support to move forward. Yeah. I'm not familiar with this.
Yeah, this seems unusual. The move king h8 might feel unusual as well, but connected with that idea of knight g8 and bishop h6, for the moment, it looks like white's going to play queen d2, and it's just been played on the board. That prevents that knight g8 move for the moment from having an impact with bishop h6, but you can still achieve it. h5, king h7, bishop h6 if you want to go for that plan, or rook f8, clearly indicating, Eric, that now it's time for f5, which is the most traditional plan when it comes to the King's Indian structures.
Yeah, I'm really curious what Magnus is striving for here, because once f5 is played, I mean, even this rook on a3, I'm not exactly sure where it's headed. Investing some time with moves like that, it feels like a good King's Indian. Black's plan is clear. And sometimes that's a huge advantage in blitz. This time controls, we've moved to the 3-1 portion. So having a clear plan where you know your next 3-4 moves, you want to pressure the king side, that should probably manifest into a time advantage for Lazavik.
Yeah, now pay attention to the maneuvering here. The rook on a3 now comes alive to perhaps go over to the g3 square in the future, or at least exert some support along the third rank. The bishop is going to go to that d4 square, as you're highlighting. That knight on f2, multi-purpose. You can bring it to d1 and to e3, where it's going to blockade that e4 pawn perfectly. And from f2 or e3, it supports the move g4. So it could, Eric, actually be white that expands on the king side, and we see it right away.
G4 before preparing it with maybe like king h2, that's ambitious. And I think we simply have to look at the move right now, queen h4. Is white risking a lot here? Is that king weak?
Absolutely. This is a big risk. I think that rook on a3, the placement is what's being relied on here, because otherwise it looks quite scary to allow the queen to come out. In terms of adding more pressure, though, how do you continue? It does look like white has that bishop to d4 move in order to have that rook sliding over to g3, so everything looks defended for the moment.
Well, I think it's clear for black. The queen looks nice on h4 and it can't be harassed easily, but you need more pieces. So knight e7, the knight might join on g6, and then on g6 it supports h4, also pressures f4. Black needs more pieces, and I'm curious what Magnus is going to decide. Do you play g5 at some point? Are you worried about the g file opening up? But it's a very risky approach, and it's at some point the position's going to open up, and then clock will be a big factor. You don't want a position like this when you're under a minute.
Exactly right. This is a position that's going to be very difficult to play very soon. The opening, I think most of the time I would say the players kind of minded their own business. They each had their plans they were trying to achieve. Now there's tension in the position and things need to be decided. At some point, black can capture on the G4 square, and that will open up that F file for pressure on the F4 pawn.
G5 I was looking at, the idea is maybe you can try to trap the queen. The queen doesn't have any room, and maybe in the future you go knight H1, bishop F2. But after H6, I don't think it's in time. H6, knight H1, takes, bishop F2, there's queen takes F4. Not sure if Magnus missed the tactic here, because if the G file opens up, it feels like black's attacking chances increase exponentially.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You talk about the odds coming in for Magnus on Polymark are definitely going to be affected by even just a single game when it comes to a match like this. I see this position as one that could go very, very wrong, if not wrong already for white. We weren't sure about this A4 plan, and honestly, Eric, the queen side has been totally forgotten. It's all about the king side. This is a king's Indian dream.
Yeah, I think you want to look at imbalances. The knight on B5 looks nice there, but the knight on A6 defends C7. So then we have to look at the rest of the pieces. And black's goal is to use every other piece, the bishop, the knight, the rooks, transfer them over to the king side and attack this weak king on G2. So expecting to see knight G6, rook G8. The F4 pawn's also pretty loose. I don't see the compensation from Magnus opening up his king side, but there's no pressure on black.
Yeah, there's also this idea, this knight on A6 is really just covering the C7 pawn at the moment. But, in the future, we could see the bishop trade for the knight on B5. That knight will jump into the C5 square. And as the pieces shift over to the king side, look for that knight to potentially wedge itself from C5 into D3. That will disconnect that rook from A3. That could play a major role in the future.
In knight C5, white, when you look at exchanges, you generally don't want to trade off your dark squared bishop. It's holding the F4 pawn. With bishop D4, you can trade it off because it's black's dark squared bishop, but that's maybe the only exchange. Because if this black bishop can stay there, unchallenged, that's just a very strong piece.
Exactly. There's weak pawns here. F4, H3. The king on H2 is, sheltered for the moment, but the knight on H4 is very strong. The F3 and D3 squares are two destinations I can see those black knights arriving to. The bishop can only cover one at a time. So there could be a situation where, and we're starting to see, bishop takes B5 and very likely knight C5, but could be also knight B4 into the D3 square.
Yeah, I think we'll see knight C5 just because it has the additional benefit of keeping maybe the rook honest on A3, hitting A4. And Denis knows that Magnus is not trading off this dark square bishop for the knight. But if you don't trade it off for the knight, then this knight has an outpost for the rest of the game, and that's a huge improvement.
That's right. Knight C5, if white were to play a move like B3 to guard the A-pawn, disaster really, because the coordination is completely ruined. The rook on A3 can no longer help on the king side, and the rooks are shifting and probably doubling soon on the G file.
I love black's position here. When I compare the pieces, once the knight reaches to C5, it's an outpost. The bishop on E2 is blocked by white's own pawns. The knight on H4 is better than knight on G3. Why? It defends F5, it opens up the G file, and maybe black can start doubling on the G file. And I just don't see the initiative or compensation from Magnus whatsoever.
Yeah, we see knight to H5 played. So hitting the F6 square, the G7 square, and you see the blue arrow indicating knight D3. I highlighted this move earlier in the game because I knew at some point the coordination could be ruined. Knight F3 instead, though.
Rook E4, that's an exchange sacrifice.
Wow.
But if you give black connected passed pawns, that's probably worth much more than an exchange.
Yep. And immediately declined. The knight can take that rook eventually, but for now, priority on eliminating that strong F3 pawn. So more to think about here for Denis.
That was a great, like Magnus could not take the exchange. That was a forced move, I think.
Absolutely. And the rook has to join the game. There was no way to play B3. Because the rook on A3, you're almost down a rook at that point. So despite the A pawn hanging here, this move was forced, and already we see a sacrifice.
Rook and knight for a queen, but the F5 pawn is weak. And so then if you can pick that up, that's a rook, knight, and a pawn for a queen. Might not be equal, but getting close to equality.
Yeah, but this is a type of equal that there's going to be big chances for both sides. This isn't the equal where, you change the channel and say this is going to be a draw. Not at all. Look at that eval bar climbing.
Rook 2 to f3, preparing rook h4, pinning the queen, and I'm not sure where Magnus can place the queen safely.
Yeah, at this point, I'm wondering.
That's a good one.
I'm wondering how Denis is going to get out of this because rook h4 is just so strong. And look at the best move is b3, just improving the position slowly, Eric.
That is a Magnus move, but under 20 seconds he finds it.
Amazing.
Rook h4 isn't ready to be played yet, so white wants to slowly improve the position because it's hard for black to find a move. Where do you place your queen? Where do you place the king? There's forks, there's pins.
Yeah, and you can play rook to h4, and then rook...
That just blunders, by the way.
Well, rook takes f5 can be played, but the problem is b3 has solidified the a pawn. That's a big deal for this variation, and the king placement on h8 is not where it wants to be.
No, the c7 pawn falls, then b6 and d6 are weak.
Let's have a look at this endgame. Rook endgames are so tricky. We're even starting to see the possibility that those pawns could just run. The h pawn and the b pawn split the attention.
Yeah, the only counterplay for black is this d pawn and maybe cutting the white's king off and coming up with some backbreaking threats. But rook b5, that looks like it's it.
Amazing technique. Getting the rook behind the pawn and a few checks, but once that rook has to go backwards, there's no hope here. And that will be a resignation. And despite the head shake, great technique when it came down to it.